I want to get through a range of issues, but I am going to start on that horse and greyhound racing fund. First of all, the 80-20 split. So that's set in law, as I understand it. And is there any flexibility in it at all? So let's say, and regardless of which one, let's say one of them is performing in a way that the state is quite happy with and the other isn't. And I think, in fact, during COVID, we saw a situation where Horse Racing Ireland needed additional subvention. And then because we were locked into this rigid 80-20 split, we then had to top up board and gone to the same amount. Is there any flexibility within that legislation at all, or is it just 80-20 regardless of how either of the institutions are behaving?
I suppose the simple answer to that is no, Deputy, I don't believe so.
Has this been looked at? As I understand it, it's a single line of legislation which outlines the 80-20.
So one of the things I've been asked in the context of the report is, would I look at this? And I have a difficulty with that because this is government policy, and I can't report to this committee on government policy. But I mean, what I can say is that this issue was pretty well ventilated in the Ag Committee a while ago, for example. So I mean, in a way, it doesn't require a report. Look, the advantages are clear. The advantages are that it provides certainty around the funding of the greyhound sector and the horse racing sector in a way that successive governments have felt to be appropriate. And the disadvantage is that the one you've mentioned there, that, you know, they both get...
It's extraordinary that there's not an accountability that goes along with the funding, you know, to either of the sectors.
Well, I don't think there's... I don't think it's true to say that there isn't accountability. So both of these bodies are accountable to this House. I have oversight arrangements, you know, all the normal accountability arrangements are in place. But the funding arrangements are set in law, and it's always possible to change the law. But it's not something... I mean, I'm precluded from commenting on the merits or demerits of government policy, and I know you know that, so...
Yeah, it does seem extraordinary to me. I suppose I can comment on it. In terms of, so the fund is financed through this excise duty collected from tax on betting, and I think there was legitimate points made during the week in terms of, you know, online betting has changed where betting is happening, and it is only these two sports, as I understand it, that benefit from this fundraising mechanism, and whether that's right or just or correct is a separate issue. It mentions, though, if a deficit arises, it's then topped up by exchequer funding. How often is it topped up by exchequer funding? How often is the full amount made up from this excise duty?
So, I mean, I touched on this earlier, and what I mentioned was that the term fund is a bit of a misnomer now. So, like, there was a hypothecated tax here up to 2009, but the reality is that what happens now is there's a negotiation in the context of the normal estimates process every year, and funding is made available through the estimates. Now, part of the justification for that is that the full cost of the estimate is more or less covered by the betting tax. But I think there's a kind of a tenuous link between the funding that's provided now and the betting tax. In other words, this betting tax is not taken out of one account and put into another account for the benefit of these. It's not hypothecated in that way. So that's the way it operates since 2009 or so, I think.
Well, just in this specific context, for let's say for 2021, where it was 96 million overall.
Yeah.
And you're saying that's not strictly hypothecated, and I understand what you're saying in that. But do we know what the revenue from the excise tax on betting was? Was it of the order of 96? Because it's certainly presented in the public eye.
Yeah.
That
yes.
This money from the betting covers our outlay here. That is absolutely understood in the public eye.
Yeah, and that, you know, to a large extent, that's true. So, I mean, there's a betting tax there, and the betting tax is certainly in the mid-90 millions in 2022. So that's correct, and it covers or matches or close to matches the cost of this. But it's not a strict process of hypothecation, but it's part of the policy picture, I suppose, that supports the investment in these sectors.
It's a difficult one to accept, and I know what you're saying. Like, Department of Public Expenditure does not like the idea of hypothecation at all, but it certainly exists in the public eye. And if there's a shortfall between it, because how it's phrased here in our own documentation is that we're topped up by exchequer funding, what you're saying is no, the full amount is made available through exchequer funding, through the vote. I think it would be fair for us to expect to be able to have clear sight of how much is coming in, albeit not strictly hypothecated, versus how much goes out.
Well, so I think, I mean, what you have clear sight on is how much betting tax is coming in. And I actually, before coming in here, I tried to get some figures on what came from where in terms of various sectors, but I'm not sure revenue have that. I couldn't get it anyway. So you have sight of what's coming in, and you have sight of what's going out through the estimates process, and you have a say every year in the context. And then there's a specific issue, I think, that under the legal provisions, we have to get the fund approved, separate from the estimates process. We have to come into the Ag Committee every year and get the amount in the fund approved. So it goes through a further process in the Oireachtas, a process beyond what normal estimates go through.
I have an eye to the clock. I just want to come back to this issue around the Irish Horse Racing Regulatory Body, IHRB. You asked them for information on remuneration and staff salary band in 2021, and was it forthcoming?
Well, it didn't come through that year, but it's going to be in the accounts, I think, for 2022, if I'm not mistaken. Caroline, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. They will be in the accounts for 2022.
Okay. Now, and I know what you said about them being an independent body, but they derive a lot of funding from the taxpayer. And so they came out in May 2021 and they said in relation to early retirement packages, maximum early retirement payment to any individual would not exceed 104 weeks of salary and or equivalent redundancy calculation. There will be no exception to this. And then subsequently in June, paid the CEO 142,000 or 58% more than the amount payable if the scheme conditions had been applied as stated. Surely, as Public Accounts Committee, or surely as Secretary of the Department, we have a view on public money being spent in that way against the organisation's own advice.
Yeah, so look, I agree. I think that happened in September 2021. I certainly wasn't aware of it. I don't believe HRI were aware of it at that time. They didn't sanction it. I mean, I think the IHRB position was that top-up didn't derive from public funds. It came from their own private funding. But that's a little bit of a circular argument, I think, you know. I absolutely accept that. So we've asked HRI to look at this from a legal perspective and see what can be done about it. And then secondly, I think in the context of our own governance of the organisations, we've agreed to kind of conduct a governance review because, yeah, I mean, I think the rules around that should be clear. And in the context of state agencies, there's a circular that says what CEOs should be paid and that determines what their pension arrangements are. This isn't exactly a state agency; it's a private organisation, but in the context of the Horse Racing Acts, it provides a statutory function as the regulatory body. And again, it's one of these atypical bodies. When we introduced the legislation in 2016, we were anxious to improve governance without compromising the independence of this organisation and without compromising the traditions of the sector, because this is a body made up of, the Irish National Hunt Club and the Turf Club, with a long history of tradition in providing very good service to the racing sector. So, look, there are things we have to look at, and we've committed to looking at them. Yeah, 100%.
We need accountability for public money. That's our role here, certainly. Just wanted to talk quickly about the TB eradication programme. I know Deputy Burke went into this in a great deal of detail in the first contribution. It's a lot of money. Are we analysing it for value for money? Now, I absolutely want to qualify that by saying, and you said it at the start, there has been great progress. And I absolutely know and understand the stress of people who someone in your head goes down on the reactor and the pressure that applies onto a farm family. Absolutely massive. I'm no way downplaying that. But like, we're setting this goal of eradication. Is that an achievable goal? And I was just looking at the spatial distribution of the TB restrictions in Ireland. There's a real concentration around the border counties. This is at least in 2019. Is that still the picture? And how are we judging value for money on this? I understand the importance of the programme, but can we get to a position of eradication? Is that a realistic and attainable goal? And I mean, we're being asked to justify total expenditure of up to $1 billion between here and 2030.
Okay, so I'll start on this, and I might ask the expert to come in a few minutes. So, I mean, I said earlier on, Deputy, that we have to have an eradication programme.
Yeah.
We didn't have an eradication program, we couldn't trade, okay? So that has to be our objective, okay? And I think the measures...
Sorry, just in an international context, and I know places like Spain and Portugal, and you've got a completely different climate, completely different agricultural system. Like in terms of Wales, Scotland, England, like in terms of international context. So I know exactly what you're saying in terms of to trade on our beef and all the rest of it. We have to say eradication. That's where we're going to. Can you show me an international comparison? That's an actual comparison, as opposed to a hotter, drier climate with fewer head of beef, etc. Is this achievable? Have we seen this achieved in a similar context elsewhere?
Well, before June comes in, because I'm going to ask her to come in, she's the expert. But look, we had a similar issue with brucellosis a number of years ago, which seemed equally intractable and was going on for decades. And we now have brucellosis-free status. So it is possible to do these things, but it's not easy. And some of the things you might have to do might be unpopular. Some of the things you might have to do might be costly. But our approach now, because I don't think you can do it any other way, is to try and work with farmers through a TB forum to try and agree on measures. Because if you try and impose measures on the people who are affected by this disease, if you try and impose things on them without consultation, it just tends not to work very effectively. But sometimes, I mean, you might be able to eradicate this disease by taking extreme measures, for example, that just wouldn't wash politically or with farmers or with farm bodies, and there's a degree of fairness involved. So I think we have to work with farm bodies on what's possible. But just in terms of the international comparison, that June, if it's not imposing too much of a burden on you, thanks.
So international comparison, the wildlife component, I suppose, is the difficult piece in relation to TB. It has been eradicated elsewhere in the world, Australia, for example, but they were able to deal with the wildlife host or the wildlife species that was involved in a different way that we can with the badger. The badger is a protected species, and whilst we do cull badgers as part of the TB eradication programme, we do recognise that it's not a sustainable solution long term, and that's why we have rolled out, after extensive research that has shown that badger vaccination is no worse than culling from a disease control point of view. So the wildlife piece does complicate the eradication, but as the Secretary has said, we have the right tools now in the TB forum to address it with the stakeholders, from the farming bodies to private veterinary practitioners to meat processors to all the stakeholders involved across the chain. And as you've pointed out, it is a serious financial and emotional difficulty to anyone who is locked up with TB. From our own point of view, it's a multifactorial disease, and the spread happens in a number of different ways. And a lot of stuff has been introduced through the forum and through our own approach to it in the department to kind of tackle the individual outbreaks. So the source of infection is identified with an outbreak, and while the outbreaks are, they're hovering around the sort of the early 20,000, the reactor numbers, the herd incident, say for 2021 or 2022, had decreased slightly, which is good. So you're seeing sort of less herds go down, but larger outbreaks within those herds. And that, as I touched on earlier, is in relation to, I suppose, dairy expansion, larger herds, fragmented herds, herds that buy in more animals. Kind of part of the problem there is they're at higher risk because of the number of movements. So it's a very complex disease, but I think we are addressing it across a number of areas and with stakeholders, which will ultimately lead to eradication.
On the badgers, sorry, Chair. Culling versus vaccination. I mean, I would have all sorts of reasons why I don't like badger culling, right, from my own political background. But I also understood it to be fantastically expensive per badger culled, to cull badgers. Where are we phasing that out as a practice entirely? Are we moving towards vaccination? Where does the balance lie currently? What's the current state of play?
So the balance currently is, so say if you take 2022, for example, there were 12,000 badgers, just over 12,000 badgers involved in, say, the wildlife programme. So just over 7,000 of them would have been vaccinated and 5,000 would have been culled. So, but that is a serious shift from when you would have had at the start in 2019 when we rolled out vaccination, it would have been less than 2,000 and you still would have been dealing with similar numbers of badgers. So it is something we're facing.
Okay, just going to have a second now.